This LOS is describe how resource use, housing sector activity, and external trade sector activity vary as an economy moves through the business cycle. Overview of the business cycle. So now we're going to continue to look at phases of the business cycle. So we have a bit of a table here. And with regards to our rows, we see the economic activity, the characteristic. So we're going from early expansion to late expansion to the peak and then into the contraction. So those are the phases of the business cycle. And then we're looking at the impact on employment, on consumer and business spending, and on inflation. So then, of course, there could be multiple choice questions based on the impact, for example, to consumer and business spending for different phases of the business cycle. So let's just go through this very quickly. The first row, economic activity. In expansion, early recovery, economic activity changes from decline to expansion. I think that's easy. Late expansion is accelerating rate of growth. Pick up on the word rate of growth. And at the peak, you're decelerating the rate of growth. And in contraction recession, economic activity is declining. With regards to employment, in the early expansion, layoffs slow down, but new hiring does not yet occur, and the unemployment rate remains high. In late expansion, unemployment rates fall to low levels. At the peak, unemployment rate continues to fall, so the rate is continuing to fall at the peak, and during the contraction recession, the unemployment rate rises. With regards to consumer and business spending, in the early expansion, upturn is most often pronounced in housing. So there's a key thing, housing, durable and consumer items, and orders for light producer equipment. The late expansion, the upturn becomes more broad-based. For example, maybe boats or something like that, where people need a bit more confidence on their expenditures. At the peak, capital spending expands rapidly, but the growth rate of spending starts to slow down. And then finally, in the recession, cutbacks appear most in industrial production, housing, consumer durable items, and orders for new business equipment, followed by a lag via cutbacks in other forms of capital spending. And finally, if we look at inflation through the phases of the business cycle, the early expansion recovery, inflation remains moderate, may continue to fall. In the late expansion, inflation picks up modestly. At the peak, inflation further accelerates. And then finally, in the contraction, inflation decelerates, but with a lag. So it's important to understand the phases of the business cycle and the impact on some of the characteristics such as employment, consumer and business spending, and inflation. So a little practice question, which is so typical of what we could see on the test. An economic peak is most closely associated with A, accelerating inflation, B, stable unemployment, or C, declining capital spending. So excellent little practice question showing you the importance of memorizing these type of tables where they've got the phases of the business cycle and then the characteristics, employment, consumer and business spending, and inflation. And then you're being asked a question with regards to an economic peak. So that's one of the phases here. And it's most closely associated with what? Accelerating inflation, stable unemployment, or declining capital spending. So the correct answer was A, inflation is rising at peaks, accelerating inflation. So we're looking at the peak, we look at the row here for inflation, and you can see the exact same word as in the question, inflation further accelerates, accelerating inflation, that is correct. If we looked at B, why is it wrong? Stable unemployment, we look here, employment, it says employment rate continues to fall. Well, continuing to fall is not obviously stable, so that one was wrong. And then we go to the row here for capital spending. Capital spending expands rapidly, but the growth rate of spending starts to slow. It says expanding. It's definitely not declining. It's the opposite. So A was correct. Again, excellent little question. You have to understand and memorize the characteristics of this type of table. And one last practice question to finish this LOS. During the contraction phase of a business cycle, it is most likely that A, inflation indicators are stable, B, aggregate economic activity is decreasing, or C, investor preference for government securities declines. Again, a good little question. During the contraction phase, so we need to look at this column for the contraction, inflation indicators are stable. We'll go to the row for inflation. Inflation is decelerating, but with a lag, so that doesn't sound like it's stable, so that's wrong. Let's look at the C. Investor preference for government securities declines. Those are the kind that say, aha, maybe I don't know what I don't know. Maybe that was in the text, but it's not in the table, you know? So with these ones, you need to be careful because it says most likely. If you look at B, aggregate economic activity is decreasing. Well, you can see that the economic activity is declining or decreasing. So clearly B is right, okay? The net trend during contraction is negative. So sometimes don't be confused. This is the trouble on the test. Sometimes you see something like investor preference for government securities, and you think, whoa, I don't know what I don't know. Maybe I didn't read that somewhere. It sounds maybe reasonable. No, go with, that's why it's so important to have these tables memorized to a very good level, because you'd be more confident that, no, aggregate economic activity is decreasing. I know that in a contraction, that's what's happening. The economic activity is declining. That's most likely. That is more right. It has to be the right answer. And with that, that's the last slide for this LOS. Thank you.